Hey everyone, Clem here. Welcome back to our Node.js crash course. In this video, we'll be exploring Express.js, a fast, minimalistic web framework for creating server APIs, and also for making the process of server creation a lot easier than we were going through in the last video. More on that in a bit. Okay, so let's get started on what Express.js actually is and how to make things work. Over here on my screen, you can see this is the way we were creating a server, right? It's nothing wrong with this way. People still use this way, but we find that more people in production environments tend to use frameworks like Express.js or Koa.js. I believe Express.js is much more popular these days. The whole point is it makes things a lot easier. And when the code starts to get very complicated, when you start having multiple if-else statements or switch statements, it becomes a bit unreadable at some point. That is why these frameworks come to make the process of server creation a lot easier. But to use Express.js, we need to, of course, download it from the npm package. And as you can see, it's not a core module like the HTTP module. So let's just clear this page of this. And as you can see here, I'm in my server.js file. It's the only file in my directory. Let me just clear the entire page here in server.js. And then I want to replicate that entire server creation process. But to do that, I need to install Express.js. And to install Express.js, of course, I need to set up my npm file. And how do I do that? We covered this a few videos ago. We say npm init. And to say yes to all the options in the initialization walkthrough, we put a -y and press enter. And then we can see we have the package.json created at the top left corner here. Awesome. So the next step, of course, now that we have our package.json set up, is to install Express. And to do that, I say npm install, or you can have a short form and say I, and we put the name of the file we want to install. You can also add a --save, but you don't need to do this anymore. That was what we needed to do to save it to the package.json a few years ago. That is no longer needed with the new updates. So I can just write npm I express and I get the Express installed. Let's just wait for it to install here. Awesome. So now we have the Express framework installed here, and we can see it here on line 22. That Express has been installed. So now let's start to use Express now that we have successfully installed Express. And to use Express, you can see that it's going to be significantly shorter than our previous implementation of the HTTP module. Let me just make this a little bit shorter, I guess. And we can compare the size of everything that we have to do here to the Express alternative. You can see that this is 17 lines. So I'm just clear everything away and then start by bringing in Express yet again. So, of course, the first step is to bring it in. So I say const express is equal to require express, just like we brought in HTTP. And the next step, of course, is we need to run the Express instance and save it in a variable. I'll call the variable app. And I'll execute the Express module. And this then saves a lot of the Express class into the app so that we have all the methods and properties exposed here in the app variable. And the next step is to define the port. I'll call this port 8002. You can call it whatever port you want to call it. And then now that I've instantiated my app, I want to create a route. So I want to define a route for the home page, right? And to do that, initially, we needed to do several if statements, but we don't need to do that here. We can just say app, and we need to use the get method. The get method saying that we expect to have a get method at this point in time to the /route, which is the home route. And then the get method takes in two arguments, the path and a function. And that takes in an argument of request and a response. And then it's going to be a callback function. This simply means that when the user hits the /route, this callback function is executed for every user. So I just want to send back a response, and you can do this very quickly by saying response.send. Remember, it's not .end this time, it's .send for Express. And we just say hello world, right? And what's next is you just say app dot listen port, and this is then quite similar to the previous implementation, but I can just say console.log listening on port. Then we can just use port here. Awesome, that's it. And you can see it's actually considerably shorter because I just added some white space that wasn't in the previous one. So you can see that this is just about around 10-11-ish lines as compared to the 17 lines of code for a similar implementation. This is like the basic route that we can create a server for to go to a homepage and get a message on, which is the hello world. So it's a lot similar to the previous HTTP implementation, but as you can see, it's a lot easier here. So let's run this code, right? Right, to run the code, I'll just say node, we know this already, node server, right? No need to add .js. And we can see that we are listening on port 8002. So let's just go to localhost, and we can see very clearly here, hello world. So it is clear that this is our Express implementation and it's working perfectly. Awesome. Congrats on your first Express implementation. The real power of Express starts to really show when we start using the helpful methods like using middleware, and when the complexity starts to increase, and then you have to segment certain things into different routes and different files, and more on that in a short while. But the next thing I want to discuss is having multiple routes. Let's say I want not just the slash route, but I want a second route. To do that, I just say another route here, and I'll call this route app.get. And I'll say about, right? And I'm going to have a request response. So in this way, there's no need for multiple if checks. It is very clear where each route is going to go. The slash route is the about route. I'll just say response.send about, right? I can just duplicate this as well and say I'm going to the contact route, and it's going to send contact to the page as well. So let's save this and let's rerun the code by saying node server, and then let's reload the page. You can see we are saying hello world. If we go to slash about, we get about. If we go to slash contact, we get contact. And if we go to something that does not exist, we get a default 404 error, cannot get this page. We'll talk more in a future video about how to customize the 404 page. Awesome. So we're making progress, real good progress. We haven't been able to discover how to go to multiple routes. Great. The next step is to talk about middlewares. What is a middleware? Well, middleware functions are functions that have access to the request and response object. These two arguments here are the request and response objects, which are very similar to the HTTP objects. It's just the Express framework has added a couple of things into them to make them more robust. The middleware functions are functions that perform a certain task before it moves on to the actual routes, which is the get route or the post route or whatever route, right? They actually come before the execution of this function. And there's another thing I did not say here. This callback function here also has a third argument, which is the next object. The next object here is actually an object that's used to make the process go to the next route. It's a little complicated, but it's mostly used for middleware and not for regular routes. But it is available here as well, but it's mostly for middlewares. So how do we make that work? What's the entire point of a middleware? It's just to check certain things are in order before the function goes ahead to execute the route. Enough babble on that. We can just explore what middleware means. And how do we make use of a middleware? We can come here to the top and say app, and the method we use for middlewares are the use middleware. So app.use. And what does the use method take in? It takes in the request. I think just I just want to use a short form now, which is more common. Just instead of writing request in full, I'll just say res, and I'll say the final one here, next. Is going to be an arrow callback function, and this function runs every single time a user tries to access any of these routes. So before, if I go to the slash route here on my browser like this, only the slash route will run. If I go to the about route, only this about route, this callback function for the about route will run. But if I have a middleware function here, every time a user tries to hit any route here, doesn't matter what route it is, this middleware function is always going to run. And why does it do that? It helps to make sure that the user is passing certain data into the server before we can allow them to use the server. Maybe it's token, maybe it's some form of cookie that they have to pass from the client side to the server side. We'll more on that later, but let's just see what data we can actually extract from the middleware. Okay, I'm just going to console.log, use a template strings. We can get the method, request that method, and we can say request for, and we can also get the URL. You know, in this way, we're creating a middleware logger, which logs information about the request the user is making. And for this to work, for this function to actually move on to the next route, we need to execute the next argument here. What it simply means is if we are creating a middleware, the onus is on us to make sure we put a next function, we execute the next function when we want the user to move forward with the request. If something happens here and we say if rec.url, for example, is not equal to something, or there's some condition, then we can prevent the user from going to the next place by just not including the next. But by default, when we have a middleware, we need to add a next to move forward to the other routes. If we don't have the next here, it stops. And I can illustrate that right now. Let me just remove the next, you know, and let me just restart the server. If I say node server, of course. And let me try to go to the contact route, right? You can see that we get it spinning eternally. It just spins. We can see that, oh, we get the get request for /contact, but it never actually ever goes to contact. You can see it's still spinning and spinning here continuously. So how do we make that stop? Let me just stop the process here. I need to just bring in the next here. This is only for middlewares, not for the get response or whatever. You don't need to use next for any get or whatever. Oh, you do, but I'll explain that a little bit better later. But in this situation, to make things go forward, to make the user hit their routes, we need to add the next keyword. So let's start the server again and try to do that. Let's go to /contact. See, we hit contact. Why? Because the next function is here to allow the user to go on to the route of their choosing, which in this case is /contact. Claim for /about etc. Awesome. So we're making some progress with regards to middleware, right? The next step I want us to focus on is route specific middleware. This is just a general middleware that it gets fired every single time we try to hit the server. But what if we want a middleware to be fired only when we hit a particular route? We can add it as in between a route. And how do we do that? I can just create a function here and say, I'll just call this about middleware. Let's say I want a function here to run before this request response function. Then I can have an about middleware. Let's say I only want anyone that passes a particular query string to get this about response sent back to them in the front end. I can create this middleware. And how do I create a middleware here? In essence, this middleware is actually a function. So I can go above here to define the function and say function about middleware. And stay with me here. This may seem a little complicated, but it really is not, because in essence, middlewares are just functions, right? I can just say this is the request and this is the response, right? And then, of course, is the next, because it is a middleware. And I want certain conditions to be met before it gets passed on to the actual response callback function. And let's say what I want is, since I have access to the request object, I can just say if request dot, in this case, to get what query strings are there. In this case, in Node.js, we can use the dot query, and then we have access to all the query strings that are there. Let's say that name is equal to clem. Let's make it small letters, clem. Then next. And if this is not the case, else, we can just say response dot send nope. Right? It then sends a response here early enough. And since it's an error, how do we add the status for the error? we can just do a response.status, and this can just be a 400 error, which means you're not allowed to perform certain operations. And then we just write that here. You are not allowed to view this route. So by default in Express, if we don't set the status, it's going to send it as a status of 200. But we can also make it 200 too. Doesn't matter. This is okay if we want to send a good response, but this is going to be a bad response. So I'm just going to make this 400. So what this is saying is, if there's no query parameter of name here, and I'll show you how to do that, it is going to return an error, else it's going to go to the next item here, the next function, which is our response function here, where we respond to about. It can be a bit confusing, but that in essence is what I'm talking about. This is what is called route-specific middleware. Enough talk, let's just see this in action. So let me go here and do node server, and then I want to go to /about again. You can see I get you're not allowed to view this route, and that is because I did not add a query parameter of name equal to clem. But if I then do a query parameter here by starting with a question mark and I write name equal to clem, I get about, right? If I do name equal to Charles, I get the same error. But if I make a name equal to clem, you see I get an about. This is the whole purpose of a route-specific middleware. As we can see, this middleware only affects the about route and does not affect anywhere else. The first middleware we handled affected every single route. And it's still affecting every single route because we are logging every single request that comes into the server, including the clem, the Charles, and whatever. You know, we're logging every request because this literally runs with every route we go to. So awesome. I know it's a little bit confusing, but I hope that I've been able to clarify that there is a global middleware and then there's a route-specific middleware. And you can have a string of middlewares. I can have about middleware, auth middleware, that all perform different functions until it hits the last item where something is returned, right? And again, this can be response.status 200. It's the same thing as there being no status because 200 is the default response for Express. We do not need to explicitly state that in Express. Awesome. So now that we've talked about middlewares, the next thing I want to talk about as quickly as possible is post requests. And how do we define a post request? We've been doing get all this while. Let's try to define a post request. And to do that, I'm going to make just another addition to this app object here. I can say app.post, right? And I'll call this route/data. So any post request / data, I need to expect some data to come in, right? I'm going to say this is request, response, and yeah. So I need to expect some data from the body, the request body, as we saw in the last video. So to make that work, I just need to say const body is equal to request.body. But if we want to pass in, which is what happens most times, we pass in a JSON body, which is just like an object literal. It's like saying email, for example. This is just an example of a JSON equal to clem@gmail.com, right? This is an example. If we want to read this JSON value of the body, there's something we need to add to our server file to make us to receive items from the client, to receive the request body item from the client in a JSON format. And this is a very common practice. And to make that work, we need to add something here before we start defining our routes and even our middleware. So we're going to go above here. It's still going to be a middleware, but it's an Express created middleware. About middleware is a custom middleware. This other middleware here is a custom middleware, but what I'm creating now is an Express created middleware. And to use a middleware, we need to use app.use. See why we get the name use? So we're going to use a middleware to make us accept JSON data from the client. And what middleware do we use? We use express.json. Awesome. This is all we need to do, express.json. And there are other middlewares we can download from the internet that do several different things. And to use them in your server, you always need to use app.use, because thankfully this is a very amazing community and there's so many different types of middleware you can install from the Node package manager. But for now, this is what we're going to be using. More on those in the future. Awesome. So now that we've added app.use, we can now get JSON data. And then all I want us to do is to say response.send, and I'll send back the body to the front end, right? To the client. And to send a post request, what we need to do is we can't send a post request with the browser. We need to use Postman, what we used in the last video. Let me just restart the server, declare first and say node server. The server is restarted right now, so there are no errors. You can see that the first thing we did is we brought in our express.json middleware, and we want to send a post request to /data. So let's open Postman. Now I'm in Postman now, and I want to send the request. The first thing I want to do is to make sure that I'm sending a post request. So I click here and select post, and then I say HTTP localhost 8002 /data. That is the route, I believe. So we go to body here, and we know that we want to send a JSON data, not a text, not a regular text data. It's mostly JSON we send from the front end to the back end. So I come here and I click on the body tab, and I go to the text tab here and select JSON. For the encoding here, I'll just go to raw. So I want to write a raw JSON value. So I can just come here and make a regular object literal and just say this is email. I say clem@gmail.com, and I say password is 123456. Probably need a better password than this. So I'm just click on send. See, I get the data that was sent to me back because I'm effectively just sending the data I get back from the client, right? Awesome. So the same will happen if we just do a put request, and that can be an app.puts, and I just call this data edit. This is just the final thing I want to do. There's also puts, there's delete, there's patch, but this I just want to do a put, and I'll end the video there. So node server again, and then I'll just, instead of doing the post, I'll do a put, and I'll do data edit, and I'll click on send. Of course, I get the same data back, and I can even edit this send. I can just make it into an object that says message successfully put, and I can say the body is the body I get from the request. And you can also try to destructure this to make it look neater. So there's another way for you to use one of the coolest ES6 features to destructure the body object from the request. It's the same thing as what we did before. I just felt the need to do things a little differently here. So let me just save this and run the code again. Click on send. See, I get successfully put body. Awesome. As I said before, there's also delete. All these things are just semantics really, but the key thing to get from this is the get request is to get data, the post request is to add data, the put is to edit, and the delete is to delete. It's purely semantics, but we'll use more of these when we're making our project. And this is where I want to end the video for now about Express. And in the next video, I'll be talking about how we can clean up this code really. Thank you.